looking for a way in early 2022 to go out into the world and let everyone know that you are a straight-up racist asshat, there is no better way to do that than screaming senselessly on Twitter or elsewhere about critical race theory, especially if it's something you want to keep from the children. What is critical race theory? Well, first of all, it's not a thing, some monolithic theory or ideology which can once and for all be defined. It's a 40-ish-year-old legal theory which is comprised of a vast body of knowledge, largely academic and open-ended, which attempts to understand how the construct of race was created and codified within American law, and how that codification creates and maintains stratifications and hierarchies based on race, which systemically cultivate and preserve racial inequality, which is exactly what we've been teaching first graders for as long as I can remember. In their 1995 book titled Critical Race Theory, which is not itself critical race theory, but rather a book about critical race theory, the authors say that CRT is an attempt to, quote, understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color have been created and maintained in America, end quote. How dare they? Specifically, critical race theory looks at our legal system and the laws which were adopted and used since before this country became a country to define race and keep political and economic power flowing in one very specific direction, which again is what my daughter learned on her very first day in kindergarten, along with finger painting and where to put her boogies. For instance, Virginia legally recognized slavery as a lifelong hereditary condition in 1662. In 1696, South Carolina passed the Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Slaves, which excused slave owners who killed an enslaved black person while they were being punished. Whoops. A 1705 law in Virginia outlined who could be enslaved: all black people, mulattoes, Native Americans, and any non-Christian brought into the country as a servant. I remember teaching my daughter all of that at I think it was the Discovery Zone. Yeah, right before we went down the twisty slide. Good times. These laws reached their peak pre-Civil War when the Supreme Court decided Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. In that infamous case, the court went full original intent, saying that black people, quote, are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. On the contrary, they were at that time considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race, and whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority and had no rights or privileges, end quote. We really should keep that from the kids of all ages, right? Perhaps the most infamous line from that case says that black people were, quote, beings of an inferior order, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. Of course, my daughter had all of that memorized by the time she was in preschool. We would actually have her recite parts of the Dred Scott decision for people who dropped by the house, sometimes even when we were out and about. She had such a great memory, and people really loved hearing that stuff. Critical race theory also looks at how our legal system post-Reconstruction continued this stratification and hierarchy based on race, from segregation, Jim Crow, and redlining, right up to the current laws which allow for voter suppression, unequal representation, and the seemingly endless litany of laws which have allowed for the mass incarceration of black people, and the ridiculous disparities in sentencing, especially when white and black people commit the same exact crime. My daughter knew all of this before she could even walk. This legal theory encourages those practicing and making our laws to consider all the ways the law has been used throughout our history to create this stratification of race and subjugate one group of people to another, denying rights and privileges to one while extending them to the other. In the past, this was done more openly. But now it's done surreptitiously and often to counter some imaginary problem like non-existent in-person voter fraud, in the case of voter ID. And speaking of imaginary problems, this is exactly what critical race theory has become. Critical race theory is not taught in our schools. It's just not. When asked for examples of CRT being taught in schools, you'll be told about some book on a recommended reading list in 30 or so schools across America, which is not taught but merely recommended, and which merely teaches children about America's racist history. Again, how dare they? When Arkansas tried to pass an anti-CRT law originally directed at schools and eventually pared down to affect only a few state agencies, Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson didn't quite have the ovaries to veto the legislation. Instead, he allowed it to become law without his signature, saying that the bill, quote, does not address any problem that exists, end quote. This critical race theory boogie monster was made up by a right-wing activist who thought it would be a brilliant idea to use critical race theory to scare ignorant white people afraid of losing their privileges once America is no longer a majority white nation into electing other ignorant white people who have no desire whatsoever to end the legal racial stratification of America. There is literally nothing black people can do in this country attempting to rise above the legal subjugation of the last 400 years, which some racist asshat will not twist, distort, lie about, and turn against them in a blatant attempt to keep them in their place. If you're genuinely worried about your school-aged children, consider the fact that they are far more likely to be molested by a priest than taught critical race theory, which might actually help them pass the bar. Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.